Dear guests of the Female Guides Requested podcast, happy Wednesday and happy New Year of 2024. This is Ting Ting from Las Vegas. I'm very excited to announce a new series Spencer, Huffman and I are creating, which we call Everything SPI. SPI stands for Single Pitch Instructor and is one of the certification programs the AMGA, American Mountain Guides Association, offers. Both Spencer and I are AMGA certified rock guides and SPI providers. We taught an SPI course back in October 2023 and found that our teaching style was quite compatible and complementary. Therefore, we decided to do this podcast series to create supplemental material related to the SPI programs. Hopefully, it will help our past and future students and potentially anyone who is thinking to enter the field of climbing instruction. Spencer and I both have deep roots in climbing education. We have over 20 years of field instructing experience and are confident that we can provide valuable insights. We also recognize that the field of climbing instruction is dynamic and we can't possibly know everything. So, if you have any questions, feedback, please reach out to us and help us improve. Thank you very much. And now, please enjoy the very first episode of Everything SPI with Spencer and Ting Ting. Hi, Spencer.
Hi, Ting Ting.
How have you been? I haven't seen you since October.
Mostly well. Yeah, busy November and just rolling into the new year. It looks like it's going to be a busy January. So hoping to work a
Yes.
lot. Hopefully get to come to Vegas and hang out with you.
Great. It was really nice that we taught an SPI course in Red
Hmm.
Rock back in October, and I
Yeah,
really enjoyed working with you.
me too.
And
Yeah.
that was when this idea of doing this series with you came from. I just like, wow, I share a lot of common concept and approach with Spencer, and then we also have similar, well, I won't say struggle, but we like to maximize the hands-on technical skill practice during
Mm,
those 3 days. And a lot of time I found that I have to squeeze time out of those talking topics that, which I call it, which can be pretty important too.
hmm.
So, and those topics are also challenging to teach. And I found that each of them can take more than, say, half hour, an hour that I use during the
Hmm.
course. So I feel that these could be our chance to talk them more in depth, and then also that students have chance to listen to this at their own pace.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, with at their own pace and without having to waste valuable hands-on time that they would maybe want to get in the field on a course.
Yeah. And
Well, I say
so,
waste, but you know what I
right.
mean.
I totally know what you mean because like the hands-on time you really need us to be right there looking at them, give
Yeah,
critical feedback. But I
sure.
think all this talking topic is it improve over a longer term of
Hmm.
time. So
Hmm.
sometimes just by talking, it can't really sink in.
Totally.
So this going to be a series of different episodes. So we're just gonna talk a lot about SPI. And today I think that I want to talk about professionalism
Hmm.
and risk
Me too.
management and professionalism and risk management. And I think these are two governing concepts for
Hmm.
the SPI program or being a guide in general. Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll ask you a question first.
Okay.
So I have my way of teaching professionalism. Like,
Hmm.
how do you teach professionalism?
Yeah. So most of these topics the hard part about these discussions, like you mentioned, is you're as an instructor or the provider, you can end up just kind of droning on for a long time. So my strategy generally is to try to get folks involved, by asking them questions. I think most people who come into these courses, they have some experience already or some sort of background that's relevant to these topics. So that's generally where I start. Just like you're doing with me here, I ask, what is professionalism to you? What does that even concept mean? Like, so generally it's just a discussion about, definitions. Like, what are some definitions with these topics? Like, what do we mean by professionalism and why is that relevant here? And it's probably a pretty obvious answer. But people have, all come from all different backgrounds in these courses. So, um, what one person ends up coming up with might be different than somebody else. So, I think that's generally where I start. Um,
So you basically ask the definition of professionalism.
Totally, yeah. Start with some definitions, and then I obviously end up kind of guiding or steering the conversation in the direction that I feel like makes the most sense. Uh, and then maybe there's some more definitions along the way that sort of come up depending on the topic. But yeah, I mean, what is professionalism? I think that's the starting point. What do we mean by that? And I think, we've talked about at length is sort of what it comes down to is, is guiding a real job? Is climbing instruction a real job? And if it is, then workplace etiquette is a part of that discussion, right? So it's like this is a working environment for us, and so we have to have some sort of, there's some sort of etiquette that governs how we behave in that space or what we do in that space. And I think that's pretty. It sounds pretty obvious and simple, but that is maybe a pretty profound concept for some folks when it comes to climbing. I think a lot of people when they first get into climbing, there's this certain aesthetic or there's this certain culture. It's different for everybody, but there might be like a specific culture that you sort of associate or affiliate climbing with. And in some ways, when you become a climbing instructor, you try to be a professional in this space. You have to sort of change that culture, right? And we have to sort of redefine what it means to be in this space and how we sort of create a safe culture or a professional culture when we're actively working.
That's interesting. Well, I think a lot of time because professionalism, well, according to the handbook, is kind of the early topic we have to deliver.
Hmm.
And I experiment different things. So first,
Mm.
I do it the first thing of the day one,
Hmm.
and then I did ask, it's like, what do people think about professionalism? Like,
Hmm.
and then maybe rephrase it as like, what do you think is a professional instructor and
Hmm.
guide? What do they look like? What do they behave? And all
Yeah.
that. But I found that a lot of time I got this blank stare. I was wondering whether this question is too big.
Mm.
Yeah. And so then I change it into, well, right now I assume and I think that a guy and an instructor is a real job. So,
Hmm.
so I asked them, well, it's a job. Then what do you think the job description is
Nice.
for a guy or an instructor?
Yeah.
So, and then we can address whether it's a real job or not maybe
Hmm.
later on because definitely my mom still doesn't think it's a real job. I
Oh no.
right,
If mine knew what it was, she would maybe agree. But
yeah. So, and then I found out if I when I asked them about job description, I'm curious. Like when you ask people
Mhm.
about professionalism, like what's in their minds of professionalism, what kind of answer do you always get? Do usually
I
get?
think, yeah. So in my most recent course, I pretty much asked exactly that question, and we kind of just went around the horn, and folks, kind of gave their individual answers. And I think what was ubiquitous is that folks said the biggest part of the job is like managing risk, which is totally true, obviously, and that's a topic that we're going to discuss in and of itself. Um, but I think ultimately what the piece I end up pretty regularly adding in is that there's a customer service aspect to this job that maybe people don't always recognize, right? So, at the end of the day, we have folks coming to us for a specific goal or reason, and it's sort of our job to figure out what that reason is, figure out what their wants and needs are, and to try to cater to those throughout the day. Um, I think it's these the climbing instructor role. It's no longer about you when you're going outside climbing. Like certainly you're going to be involved, obviously, um, but it's the key piece of the job, in my opinion, is figuring out what it is that your clients want or need and catering to those things. Like you are now you're offering a service, either for some, maybe it's just getting out and having a fun experience for the day, or maybe it's to try to, like the person or the people are trying to leave that space with proficiencies in a new skill. So that's the piece that I think generally I end up uh, having to sort of cue people into. But risk management, I mean, that's the big answer I typically get. I mean, what are responses you generally get when you ask that question?
True. Yeah. So when I ask job description, risk management, almost every single
Yeah.
person just have in one way or another, but they are talking about the same thing. Just like we manage
Hmm.
risk, right?
Yeah.
We make sure that people don't get hurt. We try to create a safe environment and whatever that means. So they all
Hmm.
are in that line. And then, so everybody will hit on that. And then the majority of the group would say, oh, then we want our customers, which is could be students or clients, to have a good day,
Hmm.
right? And then
Hmm.
that's a very broad because everybody's good day is a little bit different, and everybody want a little bit different. It could be a summit, it could be
Hmm.
just instruction, it could be a lot of other things, right? So, but risk management certainly hit it, and most people think about physical risk, just
Hmm.
don't get hurt, I think.
Yeah.
But we will elaborate that on the risk management discussion.
Yeah.
And but at least they will say they want the client to have a fun day, most of them too.
Hmm.
And then we decide to talk about, I don't know whether every job that has, now I have to look up the definition of job. It's like, is job always associated with some sort of compensation?
Hmm. Hmm.
Because say the easiest compensation is say money, right? So this is commercial
Right.
activity. So I just assume that money is exchanged. So some goods or service is exchanged.
Hmm.
So then, as a guide instructor, I think we are more in the line of service industry, the selling
Hmm.
experience. So then we need to think about our product,
Right.
right? So how we
Totally.
can add value to the. So first, we need to have a good product, and then we could potentially add value to the product.
Hmm.
And so, so that's like my job description. So it's twofold. Just
Hmm.
first, we offer this service in this environment, but this environment require us to manage risk.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great summary there.
So then, in order to do it professionally, right? So we have a job description, and now we just have to do it professionally,
Yeah.
right? So let's come back a little bit about why a lot of people don't think it's a real job.
Mm.
What do you think that came from?
I mean, I think that, well, obviously climbing is a lot of fun, right?
It is. I was just thinking about a lot of fun things like gaming is huge
Right.
industry too. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Uh, it's a question that think I have a hard time answering. I mean, anything that, again, my definition of the job, anything you receive compensation for. I think like the reason it's a job, in my opinion, is because, there's a demand and a need for people to develop skills to prevent themselves from getting hurt. I mean, people are out here participating in this activity. It's valuable for a lot of different reasons, right? It's a activity that has value for mental health. I mean, there's a ton of different reasons why I think climbing is valuable, and more than I could probably list here, more than I would maybe even be able to think of. Uh, but yeah, I mean, whatever those things that other people identify there's value in this place for is like people are participating in this activity, and I think we play a role as climbing instructors in making sure that or helping to make sure that people don't hurt themselves or yeah, and that the spaces that we're operating in are taking well care of.
I mean, people have been telling me like long time ago, it's more like, well, before guiding or even exist, and people just like, maybe some climbers just like, oh, I spend so much time climbing, but I still have to make some money. So
Right.
then they just take people out. So I'll take you on top of this route or peak
Hmm.
and whatever too, so they can make a few bucks. Then to so they have gas money, food in
Hmm.
their stomach, and then obviously they were not doing it professionally.
Right.
And then, but I think as climbing game popularity, then it's necessary that we strip. So because nobody really want to epic every single day and then eventually learn how to climb, right?
Hmm.
So we kind of facilitate that. Then I won't call it a fast track, but then in a very it's more pleasant environment to
Hmm.
achieve the goal.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe try to explain it to me one more time.
Yes, I'm just saying that a lot of jobs, if I can look at it, it could start as like, oh, this hobby, and then there's a
Yeah.
need,
Hmm.
and then when there's a need, you provide, and once you provide, you think about how to provide better,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
then that's kind of how I think that I imagine. I don't really know. I'm not the historian here, but that's kind of how
Yeah.
I imagine uh, the guy become a profession, how it become a
Hmm.
profession organically.
Right.
Yeah, because you just
Right.
like I'm like struggle say, I'm struggling about how to be a better climber. Maybe at some
Hmm.
point it's like, oh, I'll just hire a coach.
Hmm.
Yeah, but in the past there were not that many coaches. Nowadays there are a lot of
Right.
coaches. So now
Right.
coaching become, and then once a need start, and then the more people got into this industry, they started to think about how they are gonna do it better. So now with all these coaches, they have all sorts of interesting right programs for you. They monitor you. They and all
Hmm.
sorts of stuff. Yeah.
Right. Totally.
But anyway, I'm kind of go out of a tangent,
That's okay.
and I guess I'm trying to because there's a lot of this question commonly seen in the guiding industry is that people ask, what do you think the difference between a recreational climber and a guide or a climbing instructor?
Hmm.
Like, so there should be a difference here, it seems.
Sure.
What are your answers? Do you ask that question to your students?
I think that's definitely a question that's come up. It's not one that I necessarily always ask. But yeah, I mean, and I do think it's kind of a critical part to sort of defining this job and defining professionalism. I mean, I think there's a lot of different answers here. I think the big ones are uh, how we represent how we're represented, how we represent ourselves, how we represent the sort of companies that we're affiliated with, whether those are our guiding companies or certifying bodies, and then also how we as people who are being compensated for being at a crag or climbing that day, how ultimately that impacts sort of. access to those crags or just the general disposition towards climbing as an activity, altogether. Um, so yeah, I mean, I'm losing my train of thought here a little bit, but I think, key difference there is that, this is our job, and access to crags and ultimately how people think about and view climbers, whether those are land managers or just general population, that plays an impact on whether or not we're able to continue to work. But it plays an impact in whether or not these spaces where we recreate, we can still have availability to them. So, I mean, that's a big difference. It's like, as a guide, as an instructor, you play a role in how the general public views this activity, and how land managers view this activity. So I think, if you're out at a cliff and you're, you know, demonstrating some skill or technique that's, pretty obviously unsafe or not, maybe even not, far from best practice, then that's going to reflect back on the community. So that's I think a big piece, the difference between a recreational climber and an instructor, right? It's like ultimately how your presence and what you choose to do plays a role in how people perceive our organizations and how people perceive the sport of climbing in general. So yeah, so what you represent as a guide, the consequences are a little bit higher there, I think, potentially. I mean, would you agree with that?
I was I would agree. Yeah. Yeah, I guess as a recreational climber, I do still go climbing myself.
Sure.
That
Yeah.
I definitely feel less I just want to go out and have fun, right? And then my partner, I don't have to think. I mean, if I know my partner is competent, say if I go climbing with you, I'm not gonna worry about that. Oh, I need to take care of your well-being and
Yeah.
stuff, right? So
Right.
definitely, the pressure is different. About representation,
Mm.
that is also true because that remind me in the past that nobody would when I guide and nobody think I was a guide. I don't know whether it's because I don't look like a guy or just because people don't expect Asian woman a guide.
Mm.
So that could play a role too. But now people very quickly identify when I show out the crack. People quickly identify. It's like, oh, she's the guide, and I wasn't sure. Hopefully, I was doing the right thing, but
And is
but
that because you were like brandishing big logos, or just because of the way you're interacting with your participants and other people, or
I
is
think
it
it's
because you're
definitely
like,
the way that I present myself. Just like,
yeah,
okay, telling people just like if I have a big group, then I definitely have a staging area and trying to not interfere with other group. I'll talk to other guided group of recreational climbers. So then we all share this place happily in harmony and all sorts of stuff. And then definitely, I mean, well, recreational climber too, I pay attention to leave no trace and then
hmm
and also try to just like you say do things in the best practice. But the things I
right,
found that because I guide so much that also like when I do my personal climbing, I'm still doing the best practice. Does that make sense?
totally,
So even though I'm not representing, don't think I'm representing anything, but it's just tripled down to that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's the side effect of becoming an instructor, is that I think regardless of whether or not you're actively guiding that day, it's like you still are subject to some sort of scrutiny, right? The standard is still there, I think, to some degree. Um,
The other day, I also have the same feeling. It's not like I just like, wow, this person looks like a guide.
hmm.
And
Hmm.
I don't want to judge people by looking,
No,
right? But
sure.
somehow I don't think it's the appearance, but this persona,
Hmm. Okay.
right? And I'll just say, yeah, that person is not a guide. Or doesn't act as a guide. So I can
Right.
tell that too. I don't know whether because I work in this industry for so long or
Yeah.
but can you just by look then? Oh, you need
No,
okay.
I want to say,
Yes,
I want to say I'm afraid of that a little bit
right.
because I don't want to label anybody. I think like,
Exactly.
maybe somebody is just not quite as far along in their journey to being like a high quality instructor or guide. If that's somebody's goal or that's somebody's ambition, I do believe at my core that there is a path, right, for everybody, if that's truly what they decide they want to do. But that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be different barriers for people along that path. Um, I think the real question I think we're asking is like, when are you ready to take on a certain level of responsibility, right, for yourself and for other people? And so that's the root of the question. And it's I think there's not like it's dependent on the day, really. I think, trying to think of like a broad general way to decide when somebody's just generally ready to be an instructor or not, right? And it's kind of like, I mean, obviously, I would like to think that passing an AMGA SPI exam means you're ready to step into that realm, right? And offer those skills. So, I mean, maybe that's a topic for another time, but I don't know. I think there's certainly things I'm looking for, right? When I'm trying to determine whether or not somebody is acting in a way that feels sort of like guidely or professional or like an instructor, right? And I think, you know, I don't want to set boundaries or limits on like what people should wear, what they should look like, or what they decide to use. But I think what's really a clear, hard, fast line for me is, do the things that you're wearing or using or doing ultimately have an impact on people's physical, emotional, social, all the different risks that we're going to go into, right? And so that is kind of a hard, fast line for me, right? If you're going to wear a tank top in, 30-degree weather and it's windy out, like, you're putting you and your clients at risk, because there's a higher chance of, maybe that distracting you, or, even worse, getting hypothermia, or who knows what. So I do think like what we look like, what we choose to wear, what we choose to use, that has to contribute to good and positive risk management, safe risk management. Yeah, I mean, it might look different for different people. Generally, I don't wear leggings, right? But they might work for somebody else, just like normal pants work for me. So I mean, I don't know if that's the best example. But yeah, I think that's the hard and fast line for me. It's like how is this contributing to risk management through the day? What you're choosing to wear, what you're choosing to use, and we're going to get into risk management more. Maybe we go ahead and start to talk about that a little bit. But there are things that like sometimes there are things that are, so it's like harder to tell that they actually are playing a role in your risk management, right? So it's like, if I have a cam that is, a little bit crooked, right, or bent, or the trigger wire's bent, then maybe that's cam's going to hold me if I fall. Maybe it's going to work in my anchor still. Oh, nice cat, Ting Ting. But what is that suggesting, right? That like I'm using gear, or like maybe I pull out a sling was manufactured in 1985. Maybe it never got used, and it's still totally capable of holding a fall. And if we were to like actually weight test it, it's probably strong enough. If we were to actually pull it till it failed, it's probably is strong enough. Um, but
But we
but
don't
what
take probably as it.
exactly?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what does it mean that we're operating that far outside of our industry standard, our manufacturer's recommendations? So that's my hard and fast line. I mean, are there other things that come to mind for you?
Yeah, and definitely just to clarify, just like when I say look, obvious is
Yeah.
not like the race or how they dress, but in a way,
Sure.
of course, you want to dress for that day,
Hmm.
like right, function wise, right?
Right.
I'm not going in the desert with tank top. That
Right.
so, but I just think that could be a persona that I just like, wow, this person is really doing his job or her job.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, so
Right.
I totally agree with you. And I think I think this is like a good discussion that because I'm still debating. Like I'm curious, like when you present this topic, did that thought cross your mind? Just like, am I right now represent professionalism right now in front of my students?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're actively being scrutinized when we teach these topics. Hopefully, right? I want my students to be thinking critically about the things that I'm saying, and that something that goes with that is like, obviously putting me under the lens, putting me under the microscope. Um, I try to represent myself well by, wearing clothing that I feel is appropriate for the day in terms of functionality. And I think, you know, the language that I choose to use, obviously, is that contributing to a safe emotional and social space. Um, and then obviously, yeah, is it effectively helping me effectively do my job, right? Um, am I offering the best product by having, clear, succinct language, or uh, do I have a clear idea about when it's time for me to be really directive with my language, right? So like you use the terminology guide voice a lot. It's like, am I effectively demonstrating when it's time for me to be super directive, by like using my guide voice? Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit, like, sort of guide voice, but there are other times when I can just try to be in sort of rapport building mode, right? Maybe, I'm asking questions and sort of chatting, maybe making a joke or just trying to have fun. And so being able to switch back and forth in between those sort of modes with sort of like my language. Um, yeah,
Yeah, sure. I'll elaborate on my guide
great.
voice. And I actually encourage my student was like, look, each of you will have your own style once you
Yeah.
go in guiding this industry. And I don't want you to feel that you have to talk in a certain way, because
Hmm.
right, you build your relationship with clients in your unique way.
Hmm.
But I only have one requirement. I'll just say any safety related explanation, instruction, please leave no room for ambiguity.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's
Hmm.
like my biggest thing. Just like, hey, look, if you really want this person to do this because you need to manage the risk, then you have to be super clear.
Yeah.
Don't joke on it. Don't just say, oh, you decide what you want to do. Like there's
Right.
plenty of other times client there's so many different ways client choose, but there will be
Hmm.
some time that because that's your job that is safety related. I say just leave no room for ambiguity, and that's all my only
Yeah.
thing that I told them. And I would actually I welcome people to develop their own guide voice.
I think one of the biggest challenges that I experienced in throughout sort of this process of becoming a provider and just offering climbing instruction is I mean the hard part about guide voice is being prepared to use it. I think people don't really recognize that instruction, using our guide voice plays a huge role in managing risk and managing people's security. So like we like to think about there's all these big fancy technical systems that we use to try to like manage situations when they arise. But like 90% of the time, maybe even more, my first strategy is to use my instructional skills. And that requires being ready to use that guide voice, like predicting when instances might occur or when a mistake might occur. And being ready to, yes, get my hands on if I need to, but hopefully generally first, like being ready to use my guide voice, being ready to step in. So that's a skill that's really hard to, develop. And we're going to get more into teaching and teaching to teach, hopefully in another, that's kind of a topic for another time maybe, uh, but that's something that I think is is pretty challenging in this space, in this job, right? Is being prepared to step in using your instructional techniques in critical moments. Yeah, I
And
don't know.
I mean, I think that's a very important thing that I probably don't emphasize enough. I did tell people, say, hey, look, your
Mm,
instructor voice or guide voice is a very effective tool for risk
yeah,
management. If
yeah,
you tell them very clear what you want them to do, then you never have to do all those assistance skills later
sure,
that
totally.
they always are afraid that
Yeah,
they practice like a lot out of their time. But then I'll just say, look, I just want you to build good anchor and then have good instructor voice, and you probably never ever have to use those assistance skills.
sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're like a last resort.
Right, exactly. Just like when
Yeah,
shit hits the fan, right? But one of the, our jobs, we don't even want the shit to happen.
right.
So, nah, close even.
Prevention is the best strategy.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah,
So maybe we can wrap up professionalism now
great.
because I'm falling asleep myself
We
talking
talked a
about
lot.
professionalism.
No way.
Uh,
I'm wide awake.
oh, okay, great. I'm just trying to say that I think professionalism is certainly an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
And then when I teach, I told them, say, okay, risk management, we want our clients and students have a good day. And
Yeah.
and if you do that, your job's well done. And then we can
Right.
always add value later on when we observe more, get more experience, we can be better. But it's like a daunting topic. Just like, oh, I want to represent my community. I want to represent the AMG. I want to represent.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is still, just try the base, the the benchmark. I just like the
Yeah.
baseline, right? So
Hmm.
start from there and
Totally.
then get better.
Great.
Yeah. And anything you want to add on that?
No, I think we've gone on professionalism long enough. I mean,
Right.
there's a ton of other resources out here for folks
For
to
sure.
continue to use. And so I don't know, maybe talk about those later or list them somewhere.
Right. I'm
Whatever
definitely
resources
have
folks
any
have.
resources I can put it on the show notes for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or reach out to either one of us. So,
Yeah.
um,
And yeah, let's talk about risk management. Also another serious topic. Risk
yeah.
management.
Yep.
Dun dun dun. And everybody knows we manage risk. Well, as
Hmm.
a guide, right?
Hmm.
Because climbing is dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Implicitly dangerous, explicitly dangerous.
Right.
There's what's I'm trying to think of the warning sign on the climbing equipment. What do manufacturers put? It's
Oh, that's
inherent risk. It's inherently dangerous.
right. Right.
Yeah.
So, definitely, I would say compared to a lot of outdoor sport, that certainly you can manage a lot of risk in climbing, but I will always say that if something goes wrong, usually the consequence is big, right? So
Mm.
we really certainly have to be very mindful about that.
Right.
So let's talk about risk management. How do you teach risk management? I mean, at least one thing is easy is all the participant, all the student knows that's a big part of our job.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I like to start with what first comes to folks' mind. I mean, I'm trying to get people involved in this topic. I'm asking them, what is risk management to you? Again, sometimes, definitions are helpful. So I mean, like, what do we mean by risk in the first place, right? And so generally, I kind of try to start there. And I don't know that I like necessarily state or list a formal definition of risk. People kind of come up with their own sort of ideas and have their own intuition about what that means. But I think, at the end of the day, usually we land on something like it's, what are the possible opportunities for like loss or injury, right? So what are the things that could go wrong? And I think that generally folks have a really strong intuition about physical risk, right? There are obvious physical risks when it comes to climbing. And certainly that's paramount in managing in our and there's all these things we do to manage physical risk. Some of them we've already talked about. And, to be honest, I think that's most of what actually we focus on in the course, right? So I tend not to talk too much about physical risk in these discussions. I mean, we're here to learn how to manage physical risk through these technical tools, through learning how to teach, through instructing, and through developing these like technical proficiencies. So really, what I tend to talk a little bit more about or try to steer the conversation in the direction of talking about what are the other types of risks that exist in this space. And there's a bunch that come to mind. I mean, the big ones for me are sort of physical and emotional risk. Those are the two that I'm most focused on throughout the day. But there's some other ones that are sort of hidden or maybe that you wouldn't necessarily expect, right? Social risk, which kind of ties into maybe emotional. Financial risk. Climbing guiding is typically pretty expensive. People have paid you for some sort of outcome throughout the day, so they're taking a financial risk by investing in you. Obviously, there are financial risks that you face as well as a guide. And there's a ton more. I think, yeah. Are there any other things that you sort of identify early on, or where do you typically start?
Um, yeah, I also like to go with definition, and then
Hmm.
you did a good job because usually eventually we define like risk means that why risk because there's potential loss if
Totally.
something goes south, right? Um, and then if we predict some sort of loss, and the loss can be physical loss, could be financial loss, could be emotional stress and stuff, then we need to manage it to minimize the loss
Hmm.
or just eliminate the loss. Yeah. And then a lot of time, another aspect that I would try to say that, okay, what are the potential consequences, which is also loss that, because sometimes I would say that we like to say we're using the technical system, we say protecting, right?
Mm.
And then sometimes I would still choose to protect, even though the chance of the event happening is very slim, but the
Mm.
consequence is too high.
Totally.
So then I also have to manage that. So basically, I start with different kind of loss that potentially can happen in this environment we operate in, and also with the people because we provide experience to people. So there will be group dynamic between you and then the students, between among students. So that happens, and then I also talk about the chance of event happening, and then the consequences if that happens to
Totally.
decide whether we really have to do something
Hmm.
to make decisions basically. Yeah, because
Sure.
I a lot of time I address coming back a little bit about the job description. I told
Mm.
them that as a guy you actually make a lot of decisions, so decision
Totally.
making is a very important part of your job.
Sure.
You make decision for yourself, you make decision for your partner, you
Hmm.
make decision for your participants. Yeah, so
Hmm.
they all rely on you. Look at you, Ting Ting, make decision for me and stuff. Yeah, so
Yeah.
so that's that, and then we will go. I typically go in the discussion thing, and
Yep.
it depends on how these people come from because these people, these students, they are all climbers, right? So then I think they're pretty clear. They have a good understanding about physical risk.
Totally.
And then even if something they don't usually see and then you point out to them, it's just like, oh, yeah. Because I think with people who don't have a lot of guiding experience, they tend not to think about how their follower is gonna fall or how the student's gonna pendulum. But then it's kind of built in our work. We have to see that. all the time.
Hmm.
But then once you point it
Totally.
out, they see, wow, there's a physical risk. Then
Yeah.
it's very easy for them to register. But then I think the emotional risk is also not too hard because everybody is afraid of falling and to a certain
Hmm.
extent.
Hmm.
So they can understand the fear.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then
Totally.
once it's become like the group management, so we will also talk a little bit more on the later episode about the group management, means that, oh, now you manage more than one person, and among the group there will be group dynamic,
Hmm.
and then there will be some risk there. And then I
Totally.
think that's the thing that it's a little bit harder for them. They can, if they haven't had any work experience, they'll be a little bit harder for them to comprehend.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, totally. I think like there are some ways that I use this conversation to sort of set the stage about, the rest of the course when I'm teaching an SPI course, or when I'm teaching sort of these sort of topics. And so, for physical risk, there's some subcategories that I might go into to sort of set the stage for how we're going to assess the technical skills that we end up using. And so, yeah, generally talk about likelihood versus consequence, kind of like you mentioned. And then, another thing that generally comes up for me in managing physical risk, I mean, it's like this discussion usually we're identifying each different types of risk and talking about how to manage it. So, for physical risk, there's things that are obvious that are, sort of present physical risks, right? So it's like if I place a cam poorly, then that is like an obvious physical risk. Maybe we'd even call it an explicit risk. So this sort of concept or this idea about explicit and implicit risk, which those are kind of big, scary words. And they were sort of big, scary words to me at first when I heard this idea, implicit and explicit risk. But I think the more we sort of use that terminology, define it, and talk about what those things mean, the more useful it gets to me. So that's the terminology I use when I'm assessing technical tools that people are using to manage physical risk in these courses. Is this idea of explicit versus implicit risk, and that's become really useful language for me through my guiding work and in assessing other people, mentoring other people in these technical skills. And so yeah, that sort of helps me set the stage for some language that I'm generally going to use throughout the rest of the course. So I mean, we can dive in a little bit more, if you'd
Yeah,
like. Yeah.
I certainly would like that. But are you trying to finish your?
No, I
Okay.
think so we've talked a lot about this language, implicit, explicit risk. That's language that I generally use in the course. I do think it takes kind of a lot of sort of front loading and explaining. And it sounds like you have maybe a more intuitive way of talking about those sort of concepts.
Yeah. So actually, I learned about those jargons, if I
Yeah.
can call it jargons, implicit risk and explicit risk.
Hmm.
Last time that I was working with you in October. And then
Yeah.
did you mention that you also learned that from
Yeah.
your SPI training?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, provider
I
training, I
did.
mean. And
Or
yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
So yeah, I can't take credit for those concepts. I don't know the true origin of when people
Right.
started using those in SBI courses. But I first learned about this concept of implicit explicit risk through Ron Funderburk and Wes Calkins, who are both SPI providers. And that seems to be language that they were pretty regularly using in their courses. But the more I talk to SPI providers like you, it sounds like this is an idea that people are using pretty much across the board universally, but just that there are kind of different ways of explaining or
Yeah.
different terminology that people use.
And certainly sometimes nowadays that when I teach and actually nowadays I teach SPI, I also try to, if I heard like say so-called new jargons, that
Hmm.
I try to introduce that to students, even though I might have a different way to interpret them.
Yeah.
So then I'll just say, well, in the future you might work with other providers or other SPI graduates. So then at least you
Yeah.
share the language, right? The things that we call it the 3-in-1 anchor or the backside
Yeah.
anchor. Like when I build anchor, I never think about those
No.
terms,
Yeah.
right? So it's but then I'll just say, oh, it's nice to know. So then when you communicate with other people, it's always nice to have a name for a certain
Right.
thing. So,
Totally.
and then when you talk about the implicit and explicit risk, that kind of intrigued me. So
Hmm.
I just like, and what's the definition? How do you use it in the context? So, and then can you elaborate on that? And
Yeah.
then I will add on like my interpretation or how I
Absolutely.
teach people.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, explicit risk is typically the obvious one. So, like, you know, uh, I think the best way to sort of really understand these concepts is like obviously through examples. So for explicit risk, I mean, what we're saying is what are the things that are obviously dangerous about the technical skill that we've employed, right? So if I've left a carabiner unlocked in a critical place, the explicit risk there, the obvious risk there is that whatever is attached to that carabiner could come off. It could accidentally open and it could come out, and that would be obviously bad and dangerous. But there are some implicit risks with that practice as well, right? So there's some things that are sort of hidden or implied, some things that we wouldn't necessarily that aren't necessarily obvious in doing something like leaving a locking carabiner open. So it's like if I leave a locking carabiner open, I could be suggesting to my client or my participant that I am a complacent person, right? And so what does that suggest to them about my instructional habits, right? And so what other sort of risks does that create with that person? So that's just one example, and there are probably other implicit risks there that we could talk about or define. But it's just that there might be some risks you don't necessarily expect or you don't necessarily that aren't necessarily super obvious. And there's probably better examples, I suppose, that I use, generally on the course. I mean, I think, yeah. Do you have any examples that you feel like effectively sort of describe or define
So there's some
those
common
concepts?
questions that I
Okay.
got from my students, right? So I think one thing that in SPI we like to see them always close the system.
Okay.
And then the student would just say, look, I know I have enough rope,
Hmm.
right? Then
Yeah,
two ends
totally.
reach the ground. I can see two ends reach the ground. Why do I even need a stopper now on there?
Hmm.
And I usually say that. So I don't know whether you categorize this as implicit. So
Yeah,
I usually say, look, sorry, I need to deal with my cat.
that's fine.
Cause she like to turn off my computer. So
Oh,
I usually say, I usually say that look, closing system can save lives,
yeah.
and that's why we want you to always close the system. And I understand that you know the ropes are on the ground, and I can
Hmm.
see, I understand the
Totally.
rope on the ground, and I know that it's fine if you repel
Hmm.
without closing the system, right? But these require that we both on the same page. That there's no because I've been guiding for a long time, and then so I can potentially see that's their reasoning, but I say I can't be sure that's your reasoning because you
Totally.
just told me that hey look both end on the ground, so I understand your reasoning now. But
Hmm.
then before you told me this, I have no idea. I just like, is he just never closed the system or he actually knows that rope on
Totally.
the ground? So for
Yep.
me, I told them, say, look, especially when we instruct, it depends, right? My students are completely new, and then they usually take away something I do with them.
Totally.
And then so if I sometimes close the system, sometimes not close the system, then for them I need to give them the explanation. But if I somehow don't give them the explanation. What do I want them to take away? Obviously, close the system. So that's why I decide if I don't have time to build in my lesson, then I will just demonstrate that I'm like always close the system.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yes.
I think the piece that's new for a lot of SPIs here is that the actions that they generally take on a day-to-day sort of on a just an average day of climbing, when you're in the instructional role, those things are now being they're being scrutinized or you're under the microscope of whoever it is that you're with that day. And so you have to, yeah, account for the fact that maybe that person is going to go out and try to replicate whatever it is that you've done. And so, yeah, totally. They don't understand that in some situations, and maybe even in most situations, it's not a good idea to leave the ends of your rope, untied with knots in a rappel. If they don't understand that this was just a specific setting where that was okay, then that could lead to you know, some dangers or some risks for that person. Totally.
Yeah, so I often phrase you say, hey, do I need to have a conversation with you to
Yeah,
understand what is in your mind that you make that decision? Because that's
right.
opaque to me. I can't read your mind.
Absolutely.
And then so if you think that way, that because it's too dangerous for us to make assumption. We just think, oh yeah, they understand why I do that. Actually, they don't, and they usually take away what they see because the
Totally.
visual is pretty strong, right? So that's
Right.
usually people take away. So I also a lot of time I frame it into like a role modeling too, and
Hmm.
also when I after I make them practice that anchor, and then first of all, of course, I make sure they build strong anchor, solid anchor. And then after that, I started to say, you got to simplify this thing because
Hmm.
I don't want to trace all the lines and spend like a few minutes to say, okay, this anchor is fine. I want it to
Right.
be, you go up there, you look at the anchor, good to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I think to elaborate on that example, something I see pretty commonly on SPI courses or in anchor building clinics is, people want to overbuild anchors, right? They want to place six cams where three would have probably done the job. And I think explicitly both of those things are safe, right? Explicitly, a six piece anchor there's obviously nothing wrong with that as long as the pieces are placed well and they're in good rock. A six-piece anchor is totally explicitly safe. The things that are maybe implied there are that does this person understand what like an adequate anchor looks like, and why are they overbuilding this anchor, and some other implicit risks that maybe go with that is like, now you don't have those other three pieces for whatever else you might need to use them for throughout the day. I mean, so there could be financial implicit risks, right? Maybe it means that now you can't, rig another climb as quickly as you would have before, and you significantly cut into the amount of time that your participants had you for that day. So so yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example to sort of help drive that idea home for folks between, explicit, implicit risk. And I think like it plays a big role in the SPI course, plays a big role in the SPI assessment, but then those concepts, implicit and explicit risk, they play a big role in, your work as well, like when you're out there working as an SPI. So certainly we're looking in SPI exams for participants, for candidates to account for both of those things, both implicit and explicit risk. But I think it's a useful tool for folks in just their day-to-day practices when asking themselves, when making decisions out there in the field.
Yeah, I actually didn't think about the six-piece anchor. Do you have those implicit risks?
Totally. Yeah.
I still, of course, I told them that you can do it with less, but then, or make it simpler, right?
Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
but
It, I,
yes, go ahead. Yeah.
it's become a useful tool for me to sort of justify why maybe I want somebody to choose to do something differently. You know, yeah, yeah. And so yeah, I think the terminology is somewhat difficult, and there are other ways that folks, obviously, I don't want to sit there and have this 30-minute conversation about what
Right.
explicit and implicit risk is in the course, just for them to sort of understand the language that I'm going to try to use throughout. But it does, I think, ultimately, it is pretty helpful.
I see. I
So
usually use like role modeling, whether you need a conversation,
yeah,
and then
some people use style. Uh,
style. Hmm.
yeah, right. So like different instructors have different style. So I talked to another SPI provider recently, and I forget there was another where it was like style versus I don't know, safety maybe. It's like so there's things that are obviously unsafe or safe, right? That's kind of somewhat binary. But then there are other things that are maybe just stylistic, right? Um, so
Okay. Yeah.
it's not exactly transferable implicit explicit risk, but I think
Right.
it can you can kind of tie it in to that. I don't know. That's probably not what you were going to say, but
No, I never thought
yeah,
about the style.
yeah.
Because it's a little bit hard for me to see that anchor building has a style.
I
I somehow I
possibly,
can't wrap my head just like, oh, Ting Ting, oh, this is definitely Ting Ting's anchor. That's Ting Ting's style. Uh,
yeah,
so once I know they can build anchor, I just like, well, can we make it even simpler?
yeah,
Yeah. And
totally.
then, so more of like, I, I stress because during the SPI course, they typically only build one anchor with all these resources, right? So they
Hmm.
have this static rope and this whole rack. And then I said, well, when you are on the job, that typically is not the case. You probably go
Hmm.
up there, build two or three or even more anchors with all these resources. So you need
Absolutely, yeah,
to plan ahead. But
yeah,
I never tied it into this risk management there.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
great.
I think the other part of this is so I mean, there's things that are explicitly, implicitly safe. I mean, I think the the other piece of this is like often there are a lot of things that are both implicitly and explicitly safe, right? So we end up with these decisions. We have to face this decision when we're trying to manage physical risk about the tool that we ultimately choose to select. And so I think that's another piece to this physical risk management is, like often there are multiple tools. I like to think about these skills that we're teaching and that we're developing in these SPI courses as tools, right? And you know, you could use a wrench to hammer a nail into a piece of wood, right? That would probably work. But yeah, generally the hammer is the better tool, right? So I mean, I think that's another piece to this is like, there's often in these courses folks want to do things this particular way because I don't know, they've become emotionally tied to like just building a quad everywhere, right? And so yeah, certainly that's a tool that could work, but is it the best tool for this, actual setting, its actual application? So thinking about things in a more situational way as opposed to like a principled way, I think is another thing that often comes up when we talk about managing physical risk. Bit of a category change there, but
Yeah, but I understand. I kind of like that you phrase it as like, okay, we give you some tools for better decision making,
yeah,
right? So, say for example, like for me, implicit and explicit risk, these two jargon are right now are not the
yeah,
best tools for me because
yeah,
I
yeah.
feel like I spend too much time trying to categorize that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
then, I feel like right now my intuition actually serving a little bit better. And
Mm.
but then for you, obviously you found that, oh, it's actually a good tool for you for your teaching, maybe for your own decision making.
Yeah,
But then I'm still experiment on this thing, just like I still present it to my students because it could be a good tool, and I encourage them to explore all their tools
yeah,
because they always just say, hey, Ting Ting, do you want me to use this tool on this certain situation? I said, you decide. I'm not
yeah.
gonna tell you,
Right.
right? And then you decide, you tell me your decision making process. And that's actually what I really want to know. Yeah.
Totally.
So I think it's cool that, and I even told them you don't even have to remember all these jargons as long as you get the things done in a safe and efficient way. Then I'm totally happy with that.
Totally.
Yeah. So, but it's kind of like interesting to think about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's fun to think about. Hopefully other people think it's fun to listen to us think about it.
Yeah, but the implicit, and then can you give me other example that you found that really beneficial than during your teaching using those jargons?
Yeah, I think another example where that seems super useful is when I teach people the BHK, and I don't always talk about implicit and explicit risk here, but when we teach people the BHK, like this is just one example of a place where I want to see an instructor both account for explicit and implicit risk. So when we tie BHK, um, at the end of the day, if you've tied the knot correctly, it's just a normal overhand, right? And most of the knots we tie, whether it's a figure eight or an overhand, they have some sort of tail, right? That we hope doesn't slip through the knot. And if we've tied the knot correctly, if we've dressed it, if we've stressed it, if it has an adequate amount of tail, we don't have to worry about the tail slipping through the knot. And the BHK is no different in that way. So explicitly leaving that tail out. And for folks who aren't familiar with the BHK in this at the time of this podcast, maybe look up a video or a picture of the knot, or just wait to be in your SPI course and maybe hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about it. But if we leave the tail unclipped, unincorporated into the knot in some way, explicitly, it's probably fine. It's just a normal overhand with tail. As long as the knot is dressed an adequate tail, we don't have to worry about it. Implicitly, what we have to worry about is confusing that knot or somebody else trying to replicate tying that knot with a slip knot, which is like a super common knot. It looks exactly like a BHK when we've tied it in the end. Some sort of overhead knot at the end. There's two loops at what we would call the quote unquote master point. There's two legs coming out of the back of it, and there's an extra loop that's sort of like the tail of the BHK. Coming out of the backside of the slip knot. So they look exactly the same. But if I don't incorporate that tail into the knot, of course it can fail, right? The tail will slip through, my carabiners come off the end, and my anchor doesn't work, right? So there's some implicit risks we ask instructors to account for when they tie BHK. We say, please incorporate the tail into the knot in some way, either by clipping it into the master point or flipping it over or tying a stopper knot behind the knot in order to account for common human error, right? Accidentally tying a slip knot. And that example hits pretty close home to me. I was actually at a crag when a person tried to tie a BHK, accidentally tied a slip knot, didn't incorporate the tail into the knot, and it led to a nearby ground fall. And it was like an incident that the group that I was with ended up having to deal with and help take care of. So yeah, I think that's one sort of example. I think like that's probably one a lot of providers and instructors are already pretty familiar with, but didn't necessarily had necessarily tied that language into it. Yeah.
That's actually a good story because I got asked on that
Hmm.
question a lot. I just like I have this long tail, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a good answer because originally I just like I always tie my overhand.
Yeah.
And I have adequate tail. I never really super worry. And I told them that if tied not correctly, you have an adequate tail. I don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But certainly after instructing so this many years, not saying that I see a whole lot, but I did see people. I just say, that's not overhand, that's a slip knot. I see people
Hmm.
do that,
Happens quite a
and
bit.
yeah, so it's surprisingly that if I'm just in my own world, I just say I would never tie slip knot if I want to
Yeah.
tie overhand. But it turns out that I mean, obviously, I'm not judging them because I make some other stupid error
Sure.
myself too. But it just seems kind of
Yeah.
it's actually out there too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Definitely.
huh. Well, that's it. That's a good story. Now I have a better answer for that
There
because
you
I
go.
just like, yeah, it's yeah. So I'm gonna copy your story.
Cool.
That's a
Yeah. Feel
like
free to use that.
another that's a benefit of like discussing things
Yeah.
with other guide and
Hmm.
instructor.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And being open to when you've seen mistakes occur, or when you've made mistakes, we can learn from each other's examples. So
right. And you know what, Spencer? I think I'm gonna wrap this up. I know that
Cool.
we haven't talked about the social emotional risk, but I
Yeah,
think we can incorporate into the group management.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
I would love to.
because risk management is actually very prevalent in everything that we
It's going to be
do.
hard to talk about any of these other topics without going back to it. So my
Yeah.
guess is that those things come up.
Yeah, so just so our listener know that we have planned to talk about group management and site selection, and also talking about how to teach, which is a very big part as a because SPI stands for Single Pitch Instructor, so instructing is a big part. And I found teach how to teach is pretty tough too. And
Yeah.
then we will have more core topics coming up. So trying to keep this within an hour so people don't
Yeah.
fall
We're
asleep.
somewhere
Then
around there.
yeah, great.
Thanks so much, Ting Ting.